Are we live?
Yep.
Okay. Nothing like working under pressure.
Now I gotta go do youth.
All right. Technology is in place, I think. So would you mind closing that door? Although don't lock it so that anybody who can still get in, but we'll try to keep the noise out from anybody who comes in. Well, I'm glad you made it back. I always worry after we have a week off, and I forgot to say anything 2 weeks ago, like, hey, we're not going to meet next week because of fall break, and I was afraid the word wouldn't get out. But we tried to announce it in church and get the word out on Facebook. And so if you're here, did anybody show up last week and think, oh, where is everybody? Okay. Did you all? I'm sorry.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I was in my notes, I was like, you need to make sure you announce or not to meet next week. So I hope you don't drive real far. Anyway, I apologize. We're going to meet for the next several weeks without any, until the next Sunday the next day we won't meet will be the day before Thanksgiving. So we won't meet on Thanksgiving Eve, but between now and then we'll meet every Wednesday. So glad you're here in the room, and we've moved the camera slightly. We heard some comments that maybe the lighting and the framing was not ideal, so we're doing it a little bit different. So folks who are watching us online, hi, welcome. We're glad you're here with us, and whether you're watching us live or later on, we're glad you're a part of it as well. We are continuing to look through the book of Acts, and if you remember, I know it's 2 weeks ago, it was a long time, we finished by looking at the experience of Philip and the Ethiopian treasury official. Is where we ended up, where Philip, one of the 7 deacons that were chosen to administer the widow food program, ends up doing more than that, ends up meeting the treasurer of the Queen of Ethiopia on his way leaving Jerusalem. And the upshot of the story is that he was able to tell him, even though as the treasury official was reading from the book of Isaiah, who didn't understand what's this about and who's he talking about, and Philip was able to witness to him, share the gospel, share how the Old Testament prophecies predicted the coming of a suffering Messiah, one who would be crucified and risen. And the upshot of that story was that the Ethiopian official said, well, will you baptize me? And Philip did. And then went on his way, and the official went back to Ethiopia and traditionally carried the gospel back to that country. And the Ethiopian church still traces its heritage back to that one official. So we had come right up to one of the crucial, pivotal moments in the book of Acts, chapter 9, the conversion of Paul. And so we're ready for that. We're ready for Acts 9. And we are first just introduced to Saul of Tarsus. We're introduced to him at the stoning of Stephen, when Stephen, before the Sanhedrin, gives them a history lesson, a religious history lesson, and then calls them stiff-necked and said, you murdered the prophets just like your fathers did, and really gets in their face, and they are so enraged that they take him out and stone him. And as they're doing that, it says there's a young man holding the coats, not actually participating in the mob violence of the stoning, but a young man holding the cloaks and the coats of those who were stoning Stephen, and fully agreeing that this man Stephen had to die was Saul. And yet, as I mentioned, how did that episode with Stephen, how did Saul continue to think about what had happened there, to think about what had been done to this man who, with his dying breath, prayed for his enemies and prayed for his executioners, and who testified that Jesus was the Messiah? How much of that was still in Saul's mind? I mentioned that St. Augustine, the great theologian of the 4th century, said that the church owes Paul to the prayers of Stephen. So we've introduced to Saul in that little one sentence there in chapter 1. But now, in chapter 9, we get the full story of his conversion. So let's read at least part of that in Acts 9:1. Meanwhile, Saul was still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. He went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues in Damascus, so that if he found any there who belonged to the way, whether men or women, he might take them as prisoners to Jerusalem. So this is the zeal of Saul, soon to be known more as Paul. He is a zealous man. He is a Pharisee. He is convinced that this thing that here is referred to as the way, in other words, the Christian movement, the Christian church, he's convinced that these people are a threat to Jewish orthodoxy. He's convinced that this Jesus was not the Messiah. He's convinced that his followers are not just deluded, but dangerous in drawing people away from what he felt was the true path of Judaism, specifically the Pharisees' version of Judaism. And he's so zealous for this effort and so zealous in his desire to stamp out Christianity, to stamp out this movement, that he wants to go to the large Jewish community in Syria, in Damascus, and stamp it out there. So he gets letters that will be taken to the Jewish synagogues in Damascus, giving him the authority of the high priest to carry out these arrests. And so with these letters in his pocket, he heads to Damascus. Now, from Jerusalem to Damascus is 140 miles. You don't just do that quickly, probably on foot, or even if there are animals of some kind still. It probably took at least a week to get there from Jerusalem to Damascus. He is traveling with members of the Sanhedrin Guard. Remember, the whole area, the soldiers that would be all through Palestine are Roman soldiers. He doesn't take Roman soldiers with him because Roman soldiers and Rome in general doesn't care at all about what they see as a squabble of Jews. In fact, the reasons the Romans did not like having to have duty in Palestine was they saw the Jews as quarrelsome and stubborn and always at each other's throats and hating anyone inside and outside. The Romans did not like having to serve in that part of the world. So the Roman soldiers are not the ones going with Paul. This is the so-called temple guard or Sanhedrin guard, because the Jewish authorities, including the high priest, they had, they were soldiers who served in the temple to keep the peace in the temple, to keep, there from being any kind of uprising or riot or unruliness in the temple, to guard the various gates. I think I mentioned before, there was only one way that they were allowed to kill somebody. And that was if a Gentile tried to enter into the temple courts that was reserved only for the Jews. There was a big sign over that gate that went from the so-called courtyard of the Gentiles, which was where anyone could gather, the money changers, the ones selling animals, the different kinds of businesses out in this outer courtyard. But there was a gate that went from the so-called courtyard of the Gentiles to what was called the courtyard of the Israelites, which you had to be Jewish to go into that inner courtyard. And there was a member of the Sanhedrin guard, the temple guard, posted there. There was a big sign written in multiple languages, written in Hebrew, written in Greek, that said, "Do not, if you are not Jewish," this is not a direct quote, but basically it said, "Unless you're Jewish, you can't come in here, and you'll be killed if you try to." That's my version of it. It was much, but that way the message was clear: do not pass through this gate unless you're Jewish. And there was a guard stationed there. If a Gentile tried to get through get into that gate, they had permission to kill them with a sword. So these are the guards that we're not ever told exactly how many of these men are going with Saul, to Damascus to aid in his authorization to arrest Christians. there would probably be not a lot of camaraderie between Saul and these men, because Saul was a Pharisee, and the Sanhedrin guard worked for the high priest, who were Sadducees. And there's already conflict between Pharisee and Sadducee. Again, the Pharisees were the ultra-religious, we might say fundamentalist Jews who felt like they were holier than anyone else and obeyed the laws down to the last iota. The Sadducees, of which the temple high priests were members, the Sadducees had to collaborate with the Romans to get their authority. So the Pharisees immediately saw them as suspect, and the Sadducees only accepted the first 5 books of the Scriptures as authoritative, just Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The Pharisees accepted many more books as authoritative, the books of the prophets. So there was lots of friction between Sadducee and Pharisee. So the guards worked for the Sadducees, but they're accompanying Paul, a Pharisee, Saul, a Pharisee, on this task. So there's probably not a lot of chit-chat as they're going all the way 140 miles to Damascus. And so they're traveling along, and verse 3, as he being Saul, as he neared Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice say to him, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? And notice his response. Who's talking? Who is speaking to me? Who are you? Because Saul did not see himself as a persecutor. He saw himself as a champion of righteousness and orthodoxy. Who are you? I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. He replied, now get up and go into the city, and you'll be told what you must do. The men traveling with Saul, these are these guards, stood there speechless. They heard the sound, but didn't see anybody. Saul got up from the ground, but when he opened his eyes, he could see nothing. So he's blinded by this flashing light. This flashing light. They led him by the hand into Damascus. For 3 days he was blind, and he did not eat or drink anything. So picture Saul, full of righteous and his mission of shutting down this what he saw as blasphemous and false movement, when a flash of light and a voice from heaven says, why are you persecuting me? Who are you? I'm Jesus. And he is blinded. He is knocked to the ground. He is dumbfounded. He is suddenly unable to even, make his own way. He has to be led by the hand. And they take him into Damascus, where he neither eats nor drinks for 3 days. Think about what's going through his mind. His whole world, has been turned upside down. Everything he thought about, everything he was so convinced of, has been flipped. And for 3 days, he doesn't really know what to do other than contemplate this experience. Now, we often refer to people having a Damascus Road experience. When somebody has a Damascus Road experience, it means somebody whose conversion to Christianity is sudden and overnight. Not that most of us in this room probably did not have a Damascus Road conversion. I won't ask for testimonies right now because somebody may, but it is a different kind of way of coming into Christianity. You've probably heard me in sermons or studies talk about one of my close friends, a fellow who, by the way, happened to be named Paul, who he and I are now good friends. But, I grew up in the church. He grew up not in the church. And he and I were at OU at the same time, although we didn't know each other at the time. While I was getting ready to go to seminary, he was a pharmacy major who was also a cocaine addict and who was also a Satanist. So he was addicted to cocaine. He was practicing the occult and Satanism. And he was on a road to, perdition. But somehow, he had a Christian girlfriend. And you wonder how that ever happened. And she constantly tried to drag him to church. He constantly refused. But somehow, one night, she wanted him to come to some sort of church service. He delayed and put it off and only showed up for the last few minutes. So it was almost over. It was just the time where the pastor or evangelist was offering the invitation. And he had a Damascus Road experience. He had a sudden, overnight, 180-degree turnaround in his life. Where that night he gave his heart to Christ. He stopped using drugs. He still went to rehab just because it was the wise thing to do. He gave up drugs. I mean, he had a overnight Damascus Road conversion, and less than a year later, he had enrolled in seminary. I mean, and he's one of my close friends, but he and I had very different roads to ministry. I grew up going to church. I grew up as a Christian. He grew up and had this 180 turn. That's what Paul had. Paul had a 180 turn. And what we'll talk about, though, I said Paul is a driven man. Paul is a relentless man. And that's what, he persecutes Christianity relentlessly. He tirelessly is out to stamp out Christianity. He's a dog with a bone. He is unrelenting before his conversion and after his conversion. His personality, that personality trait, his drivenness, his tirelessness, his stubbornness, that stays his personality as a persecutor of the church and as an ambassador of the church. His core personality trait there remains. It's 180 degrees, but when somebody turns their life over to Christ, it changes a lot, but it doesn't change every core personality trait. God uses those personality traits, and you say, why of all the people does he choose Saul of Tarsus? Why would God pick him, an enemy, a persecutor? Well, because he had the ability, the credibility to speak from experience and to have a drive that was necessary for his ministry and his mission. And so we hear, so he's there, he's blind, hasn't eaten in 3 days, hadn't drunk anything in 3 days. He's sitting there, what do I do now? Then we find out in verse 10, in Damascus there was a disciple named Ananias. Obviously not the same Ananias that dropped dead a few chapters earlier. Okay? The thing about the Bible is several people have the same names. There's lots of Marys, etc., etc. There's a different fellow named Ananias. There was a disciple named Ananias. The Lord called him in a vision. Ananias, yes, Lord. The Lord told him, go to the house of Judas on Straight Street. Again, obviously not the same Judas. The Judas on Straight Street, and ask for a man from Tarsus named Saul. For he's praying. In a vision, he has seen a man named Ananias come and place his hands on him to restore his sight. So we said there's a Christian community in Damascus. We may not think of Syria as the place today where there would be a Christian community, but there was a Jewish Christian community in Damascus. God calls this man to go and make contact with Saul. And notice Ananias' response in verse 13, Lord, I've heard many reports about this man and all the harm he's done to your saints in Jerusalem. And he's come here with authority from the chief priests to arrest all who call on your name. In other words, Lord, you may not know this. Lord, you may not have heard this, but let me fill you in about this fellow Saul. I know you probably don't realize this, but he's actually not a good guy, and he's been hurting our folks, and he's come here not to help us, but to hurt us. And Lord, I just thought I better let you know that before you send me over there, because he is definitely going to be a hostile person to me and to us. Which I just think it obviously is kind of funny, although how many times do we think we need to tell God something that somehow he must not know? God is directing us to do something. Well, God, but you don't realize. God, you don't know what I'm going through. You don't know my situation, Lord, or you don't understand why I'm not doing that, Lord. I mean, yeah, he does. We rarely have to fill God in on the news. But you can understand why Ananias says this, like, really? This is who you want me to go to? Verse 15, the Lord said to Ananias, go. This man is my chosen instrument to carry my name before the Gentiles and their kings and before the people of Israel. I'll show him how much he must suffer for my name. He is the one I've chosen. He's the instrument that is for a unique ministry, which is bringing the gospel to the Gentiles. Which, again, a Pharisee is not the person you would naturally think is the one who's going to go and talk to Gentiles. Because if anybody was dedicated to staying away from Gentiles, it was Pharisees. If anybody would steer clear of Gentiles, it was Pharisees. And Paul is a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. But he's the one I've chosen. So Ananias, to his credit, says, okay. So Ananias went to the house and entered it. Placing his hands on Saul, he said, Brother Saul. Notice that. Brother Saul. This is a man he knows to have been an enemy of the church, an enemy of Jesus. But because on God's direction and God's word, he calls him brother, because that's what happens when you join the family of God. You share the same Father, so that makes you brothers and sisters. He calls him brother. Brother Saul. The Lord, Jesus, just in case you're not sure who I'm talking about, the Lord, Jesus, who appeared to you on the road as you were coming here, has sent me so that you may see again and be filled with the Holy Spirit. Immediately, something like scales fell from Saul's eyes, and he could see again. He got up and was baptized, and after taking some food, he regained his strength. So, this is the conversion of Paul. Now, just so we kind of get the timeline straight here as to what happens next, go to the book of Galatians. So, Galatians is right after 2 Corinthians. Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, then Galatians. This is Paul's own version of this experience. So we just read in the book of Acts. This is Luke's telling of the story of the conversion of Saul to Paul. But Paul himself tells the story in his letter to the Galatians. So let's read Paul's account of this. Let's start back at Galatians 1:11. Galatians 1:11. I want you to know, brothers, that the gospel I preached is not something that man made up. I didn't receive it from any man, nor was I taught it. Rather, I received it by revelation from Jesus Christ. For you've heard of my previous way of life in Judaism, how intensely I persecuted the church of God and tried to destroy it. I was advancing in Judaism beyond many Jews of my own age and was extremely zealous for the traditions of my fathers. But when God, who set me apart from birth and called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son in me so that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I didn't consult any man, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to see those who were apostles before I was. I went immediately into Arabia and later returned to Damascus. Then after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to get acquainted with Peter and stayed with him for 15 days. I saw none of the other apostles, only James, the Lord's brother. I assure you before God that what I am writing you is no lie. Later, I went to Syria and Cilicia. I was personally unknown to the churches of Judea that are in Christ. They only heard the report. The man who formerly persecuted us is now preaching the faith he once tried to destroy. And they praised God because of me. 14 years later, I went up again to Jerusalem, this time with Barnabas. I took Titus also with me. I went in response to a revelation and set before them the gospel that I preach among the Gentiles. But I did this privately to those who seemed to be leaders for fear that I was running or had run my race in vain. So we'll stop there. So just here's the sequence of events. If we take Luke's account and we take Paul's own account, here's the order of how things happen. There's the Damascus Road experience that we just read about. Then, let's look at halfway through 19. The second half of verse 19. Saul spent several days with the disciples in Damascus. At once he began to preach in the synagogues that Jesus is the Son of God. All those who heard him were astonished and asked, "Isn't this the man who raised havoc in Jerusalem among those who call on this name? And hasn't he come here to take them as prisoners to the chief priests?" Saul grew more and more powerful and baffled the Jews living in Damascus by proving that Jesus is the Messiah. So Paul has his Damascus Road experience on the Damascus Road. He comes into Damascus. He has the time with Ananias. He regains his sight. He's baptized. He immediately goes into the synagogues and starts preaching Jesus. These are the synagogues that he had letters from the high priest giving him permission to arrest Christians. Those are the same synagogues he was going there to deliver these letters showing he had the authority of the high priest. He goes to those synagogues and starts preaching. Then, according to his own account in Galatians, he goes for a while to Arabia as sort of a private retreat, just to get his thoughts together, just to process all of this. Then he goes back to Damascus. And he stays in Damascus for 3 years. So Paul stays in Damascus for 3 years. Then, after 3 years in Damascus, he goes to Jerusalem, which is what he talks about in the letter, where he encounters Peter and James, the brother of Jesus. Remember, this is not James the fisherman that has already by this time been martyred. This is James, Jesus' brother, who doesn't come to faith in Christ until after the resurrection. So this is this sequence, and we're going to see more of the sequence of Paul's life. But just to make sure we're clear on how Paul recounts his own story and how Luke tells the story. So he's preaching in the synagogues of Damascus, and the people are flabbergasted, going, "I thought he came here to arrest the Christians. Now he's one of them? I thought he came here to persecute these people, and now he's claiming him as the Messiah." So, people are like, what's going on here? So, verse 23 shows something about sometimes how Luke will cover a whole lot of territory. 23, after many days had gone by, 3 years, okay, that's many days. After 3 years had gone by, after many days had gone by, the Jews conspired to kill him. But Saul learned of their plan. Day and night they kept close watch on the city gates in order to kill him. But his followers took him by night and lowered him in a basket through an opening in the wall. Now, again, think about Paul is, for over 3 years, he continues to preach Christ, and I'm sure after a while the synagogue no longer allowed him to do that, but he continues to preach Christ, and there are it says nobody could basically stand up to his arguments. Verse 22, Saul grew more and more powerful and baffled the Jews living in Damascus by proving that Jesus is the Messiah. So, what do you do when you can't win the argument with someone? Well, kill them, right? I mean, if you can't, somebody is, if you're arguing with somebody and they keep winning the argument and having the facts on their side and reason on their side, how do you respond? Well, eventually you're like, well, I guess I'll just have to kill them because I don't have any way to respond to the argument. I can't defeat them in a debate, so I guess I better murder them. That doesn't happen here too often in our country, but it is, maybe not literal murder, but I don't know, if you ever, I won't go there, but if you ever watch people arguing on these news shows and arguing in these things, it's like they're doing this. This person says, here's this fact and here's this argument, and this person goes, well, what about this? And doesn't counter this argument. I mean, they talk past each other, in other words. They don't actually say, well, I believe A, B, and C. And the other person, well, here's why I don't believe A, B, and C because of X, Y, and Z. I mean, it's not like that. It's like, I'm going to make this argument. Well, I'm going to ignore you. I'm going to make this argument. And we're going to talk past each other. And we're never going to actually engage in facts or logic or reason or have an actual debate. We're just going to talk past each other. But here, they can't stand up to Paul's argument, so they think the only way they can shut him up is to kill him. So remember, these are walled cities. Damascus is a walled city. So there's a city gate. Like most cities in that time, the gates are closed at night and opened in the morning. And, they decide they can't just kill Paul in broad daylight. So they're going to try to see if he tries to leave town, there's going to be somebody stationed near the gate to be able to quietly kill him. But this plot becomes known. Now, there are actual houses built all along the wall of the city. So one of those houses must have belonged to a Christian. So instead of when Paul needs to leave Damascus, finally, instead of him leaving by the city gate, they put him in a basket and lower the basket down out of a window, down into the street, so he can leave Damascus without being seen by the people who've plotted to kill him. This is kind of the first of Paul's many narrow escapes, and this is not the last time Paul is going to be near death. So this is how he comes out of Damascus, and when he goes to Jerusalem. And he already talked about that in the Galatians passage, but here it says, here's how Luke tells the story in 9:26. When he came to Jerusalem, he tried to join the disciples, but they're all afraid of him. Well, haven't they been reading the news and watching CNN? And even though he's been a Christian now for 3 years or more, that word hasn't gotten back to the Jerusalem church. They were all afraid of him, not believing that he was really a disciple. Can you blame them? The last time they saw Paul, when he left Jerusalem, he was breathing fire. He had been there at the stoning of Stephen and was in full agreement with it. So you can't really blame them for not trusting him, thinking, well, he's just pretending to be a Christian so he can infiltrate and then, get us all arrested. So they're at first not going to trust him. But Barnabas took him and brought him to the apostles. Barnabas. He told them how Saul on his journey had seen the Lord, and that the Lord had spoken to him, and how in Damascus he had preached fearlessly in the name of Jesus. So Saul stayed with them and moved about freely in Jerusalem, speaking boldly in the name of the Lord. Now, you may think about Paul, especially in this book of Acts, as kind of this, Lone Ranger out there. But Paul is not a Lone Ranger. And already think about how 3 men have already impacted Paul. There's Stephen, who Paul witnessed as a martyr. There's Ananias, who comes to him, prays for him, baptizes him. And now there's Barnabas, who when everybody else is wary of Paul, Barnabas says, look, I know him, I've heard his story, we can trust him. And Barnabas brings him to the Jerusalem church and to the apostles and vouches for him. So, those three men have already helped Saul, a.k.a. Paul, in his journey towards being the great missionary that he becomes. So Barnabas, and remember Barnabas is a nickname. We find out later that Barnabas' actual name is Joseph, but he's called Barnabas, which means the son of encouragement. Barnabas, the son of encouragement, is what that nickname means. And his life is going to play that out. And again, spoiler alert, Barnabas' nephew is Mark, John Mark, as in the Gospel of Mark. So Barnabas is an integral part of this whole family story. We'll meet Barnabas again a little bit in a couple of chapters. So Saul, verse 28 now, 9:28, Saul stayed with them and moved about freely in Jerusalem, speaking boldly in the name of the Lord. He talked and debated with the Grecian Jews, but they tried to kill him. It's the Grecian Jews, if you go back to Stephen, first getting kind of in trouble. It says in Acts 6 that we read last week, talking about the opposition to Stephen. Acts 6:9. Opposition to Stephen arose, however, from members of the synagogue of the freedmen, as it was called, Jews of Cyrene and Alexandria, as well as the provinces of Cilicia and Asia. These men began to argue with Stephen. They could not stand against his wisdom or the spirit by whom he spoke. These are, in that chapter, these are the same people now that are upset with Saul, a.k.a. Paul. He is debating with the Grecian Jews, which is probably the members of these same synagogues that are. There are, of course, Jerusalem is a huge city. There's multiple synagogues all throughout Jerusalem, and some of them were Palestinian Jews, some of them were Grecian Jews. And these particular synagogues are Grecian Jews. That has to do primarily with what language would be spoken in the synagogue. Because remember, the so-called Grecian Jews are called that not because they lived in Greece, but because they spoke Greek, as opposed to speaking Aramaic, the derivative of Hebrew. So they want to kill him too. He's got plenty of people standing in line to kill him. They tried to kill him. When the brothers learned of this, they took him down to Caesarea and sent him off to Tarsus. Caesarea is a place we're going to hear a lot about. Caesarea is the Roman capital, or the Roman, capital is not quite the right word. Caesarea is where the commanders of the Roman military in Palestine were headquartered. Okay. Caesarea is sort of the central location for the Roman occupation of Palestine. So that's why Caesarea becomes an important place. And of course, Tarsus is where Paul is from. He's Saul of Tarsus. Now we have another one of these verses that kind of just sums up all throughout the book of Acts. We have sort of sum up verses, and this is one of them. The church throughout Judea, Galilee, and Samaria. Remember, the gospel has made it into Samaria. The church throughout Judea, Galilee, and Samaria enjoyed a time of peace. It was strengthened and encouraged by the Holy Spirit. It grew in numbers, living in the fear of the Lord. So this is periodically in the book of Acts. Luke will have one of these sort of summation verses, and then for a while things were were going okay. There was kind of a time of calm and peace after Paul left Jerusalem. Now, you might think, oh, now we're going to follow Paul. No, we've heard about Paul's conversion, but now we're going to go back to Peter. So we're not ready to. When we're going to get here in a few chapters, the second half of the book of Acts is primarily following Paul. We're not there yet. We're still going to go back and stick with the story of Peter for a while. So in verse 32, we go back to the story of Peter. So 9:32. As Peter traveled about the country, he went to visit the saints in Lydda. Now, there's several times here. This is like the second time that Luke has used the word saint to talk about the Christians. And let's think about that word for a minute, the saint. Because a lot of folks grow up, when they hear the word saint, they think, like in the Catholic Church, all the saints, the apostles, St. Andrew, St. John, St. Matthew, St. James. We even have Methodist churches, of course, named after, and we use the word saint, too. St. Matthew, St. Mark, St. James, all here in Tulsa. But in the Roman Catholic Church, the saint is somebody who, it is an official title given by the church to somebody who is perceived as being someone who was able to perform either a miracle, or someone prayed to them and a miracle was performed after a prayer to them. It is a process in the Catholic Church called canonization. And there have been 20th century Christians in the Catholic Church who have been canonized. Mother Teresa is Saint Teresa. I think John Paul is too now. Anyway, that's the way the Roman Catholic Church uses the word saint. And, in the Catholic Church, there's even sort of this idea of, I pray to a saint, and the saint talks to Mary, and Mary talks to Jesus, and then Jesus can talk to God. It's kind of like, I got to go up the ladder to get to God. I got to go from saint to Mary to Jesus to God. But the word saint scripturally is not used of a elite level of Christian, a super Christian. The word saint is simply a word for a Christian. In the Bible, the word saint simply means a believer in Jesus. So we are the saints. Now the word saint, in Greek, the word saint is hagios. In Hebrew, and just you want to spell it, it's Hagios using English letters. I'm not going to spell it with Greek letters. In English, it's the Greek word hagios, which is translated saint. In Hebrew, the word that's translated, I'll get to that in a minute, but the word saint, it means the Holy One. Okay? The word saint literally means the Holy One, or the Holy Ones. But again, we hear the word holy, and we think, again, super Christian. Okay? The word holy doesn't mean super Christian. The word holy doesn't mean morally superior. The word holy means literally different. Different. Okay? Because to be a Christian was to be different. Now, it's similar to the Hebrew word, which is usually translated holy, which is kadesh. And you could spell that Qodesh if you want to spell that. Kadesh, which means also different, or literally in Hebrew, the word holy means set aside for a special purpose. Set aside for a special purpose. So the word holy means different, set aside for a special purpose. Which you think about in the Old Testament, what do they call the nation of Israel? A holy nation, right? A holy people. The people of Israel in the Old Testament, Israel is to be a holy nation, and which literally meant Israel is a nation set aside for a special purpose. It doesn't say that Israel is better or more moral or more righteous or more godly. To call Israel a holy nation is to say Israel, God chose Israel, in other words, the descendants of Abraham. If you remember the first promise to Abraham, all the way back in the book of Genesis, when God says to Abraham, your descendants will be a holy nation. Your descendants will be set aside for a special purpose. He said it will be a nation of priests. In other words, Israel, the original goal, the original definition, and why did God call Israel a holy nation? Because Israel was meant to be a nation of priests. In other words, he says, and through them all the world will be blessed. That's in the original promise to Abraham. The idea is God has this nation of Israel, and they are set aside to basically bless the world as a nation of priests, as a nation, like yeast in the loaf. But the nation of Israel very quickly doesn't hear it that way. They hear it as not set aside for a special purpose, but set aside for a special privilege. Set aside to be above the other nations. Set aside to be God's favorite nation. And if you go all the way back to the promise to Abraham and what God says to Abraham about what his descendants are meant to be, it's not that they are set aside for privilege, that they're set aside to be a purpose to bless the earth, to bless the world. But by the time of Jesus, this idea that Israel was not just God's favorite, I think I talked either last week or the week before, the Pharisees especially, people like Saul, people like, the Pharisees that Jesus was always in conflict with, they believed that not only were the Jews God's favorite, they believed that the Jews were the only people God even cared about or loved. I remember the Pharisees often said, well, why did God make Gentiles? As fuel for the fires of hell. That the people of Israel were destined to rule the nations. The Pharisees said, if you saw a Gentile woman in labor, do not help her, because you would be helping just to bring one more Gentile into the world. So the Pharisees especially saw themselves as being a people of privilege and the only people that God truly cared about or loved. Now, I say all that because to just remind us what the word holy and the word saint means. Because often when we hear the word holy and we hear the word saint, we somehow think morally superior or goody-goody or, we hear the word holy that way. The word holy just means set aside for a special purpose. The early Christians were set aside by God for the purpose of spreading the gospel. They were set aside by God for the purpose of evangelizing the world. So I sometimes joke, if you read the word holy, those guest towels that are in your bathroom? Those are holy towels. Because they're only supposed to be used by guests, right? So they are set aside for a special purpose. So they are holy towels. That bowl that's the dog dish? That's a holy bowl. Because it has been set aside for a special purpose. So the word holy means set aside. It doesn't mean goody-goody. It doesn't mean extra moral. It doesn't mean morally superior. It just means set aside for a purpose. So when the Bible talks about the saints, it's talking about just the Christians. It's just another word for Christian. When the saints come marching in, I want to be in that number. When the saints come marching in, that's all of us. Okay? It doesn't mean we're better than anybody. It just means we've discovered the gift of grace through Christ that we are called upon to share. That's our purpose. So, anyway, all that to say, that's why he calls us saints. So, back to 9:32. As Peter traveled about the country, he went to visit the saints in Lydda. There he found a man named Aeneas, a paralytic, who'd been bedridden for 8 years. Aeneas, Peter said to him, Jesus Christ heals you. Get up and take care of your mat. Notice he doesn't say, I heal you. Jesus heals you. Immediately, Aeneas got up, and all those who lived in Lydda and Sharon saw him and turned to the Lord. So Peter is doing what he saw Jesus do. In Joppa, there was a disciple named Tabitha, which when translated is Dorcas. Tabitha is the Hebrew word. Dorcas is the Greek word. Both of them translate as gazelle. Okay. So Tabitha is Hebrew for gazelle. Dorcas is Greek for gazelle. So her name was Gazelle. In Joppa there was a disciple named Tabitha, which when translated is Dorcas, who was always doing good and helping the poor. About that time she became sick and died, and her body was washed and placed in an upstairs room. Lydda was near Joppa. So when the disciples heard that Peter was in Lydda, they sent 2 men to him and urged him, please come at once. Peter went with them. And when he arrived, he was taken upstairs to the room, this room where they've laid out Tabitha. All the widows stood around him, crying and showing him the robes and other clothing that Dorcas had made while she was still with them. So Dorcas is somebody who was generous and made clothes for the widows, and they are all heartbroken at her death. Peter sent them out of the room, and he got down on his knees and prayed. Turning towards the dead woman, he said, Tabitha, get up. She opened her eyes, and seeing Peter, she sat up. He took her by the hand and helped her to her feet. Then he called the believers and the widows and presented her to them alive. This became Joppa, and many people believed in the Lord. Peter stayed in Joppa for some time with a tanner named Simon. Peter's done some miraculous things up to this point. Peter and John in the temple, the crippled man that Peter said, I don't have any silver or gold to give you, but in the name of Jesus, stand up. And the man stood up. We're told about how another man who was paralyzed, this Aeneas, again, in the name of Jesus, he healed him. But this is a whole different thing. They at least said she's dead. This is like Lazarus. This is different. And I'm just trying to imagine what's going through Peter's mind when they call him and say, Peter, do something. And he's thinking, this is a pretty tall order here. And he sends him out of the room. He gets down on his knees and he prays. And you think he's going, oh, this is too big. This is too much. But Lord, okay. And he remembered, when Jesus did the same thing with a little girl in the Gospels, where he told her, get up. And the little girl, who they thought at least was dead, got up. So this miracle, this woman that was this beloved woman, who now and you can say, well, was she really, totally, really, fully dead? Well, she appears to have been at least. This is a miracle that draws a lot of attention in Joppa. Now, everything up to this point, Christianity is still in the realm of Judaism. All these people, with the possible exception of the Ethiopian that we met on the road, but everyone that they've been going to, everyone who's been converted at this point, a legion is made up of 10 cohorts of 600 men. So there's 10 cohorts of 600 men that together make up a Roman legion. Within a cohort of 600 men, there are 6 centuries of 100 men. Okay? So You go from a century of 100 to a cohort of 600 to a legion of 6,000. That's the breakdown of military groupings in the Roman army. Each century had a centurion. He's called a centurion because he was over 100 men. And the same reason we use the word century to talk about 100 years. A centurion is a Roman soldier over 100 other soldiers. And he is sort of the backbone of the Roman military. He is the career military man. He is he's not born into wealth or anything like that. But the centurions are the tough, just career soldiers who are chosen as being good leaders, being steady and not prone to rash decisions, being loyal to Rome, being men of courage, being the men that other men would respect. These are the career military men. These are the centurions. And in the Bible, we meet several different centurions, and every time we meet a centurion in the New Testament, it's a positive portrayal. Every centurion in the Bible is portrayed usually positively. So Cornelius is a centurion, and we learn about him. He was a centurion in the Italian regiment. He and all his family were devout and God-fearing. Now, God-fearing is a technical term in the New Testament, a God-fearer. And I think I've mentioned this before. There were Gentiles who were drawn to Judaism. There are Gentiles who they just saw the Roman religion as something they just didn't want to have anything to do with. Roman religion is adapted from Greek religion. They took the Greek gods and just gave them different names. They took Jupiter and called him Zeus, etc. They just took all the Greek gods and gave them Roman names and sort of transferred the religion into a Roman religion. And all throughout the Roman Empire, there are temples to the various Roman gods and goddesses. Zeus is the king of the gods. But then there's all these other gods. And if you've ever studied Greek mythology or any of that, about there's Athena, the goddess of wisdom. There's, Artemis, the goddess of the hunt. There's, Mercury, who, you always see is delivering flowers for FTD. On and on and on. There's Hermes, and there's all these, there's Apollo, who's the sun god. There's all these Greek gods who've now been given Roman names. So if you read mythology, they'll often have two names. But it's a very in Greek it's Heracles. For the Romans it's Hercules. So it's just a slight different pronunciation. Anyway, so there were people there were people in the Roman Empire who they didn't believe. This whole we talk about a pantheon. The pantheon of the gods. Pan means all. Theos means God, like theology. Pantheon means all the gods. Okay, so the pantheon of the Greek and Roman gods, all these gods and goddesses. And if you've ever read Greek mythology, these gods and goddesses are not all good. Matter of fact, they cheat on each other, they conspire against each other, they marry, they divorce, they commit adultery against each other, they have kids, the kids kill the parents kill the kids. I mean, Greek mythology is full of all kinds of, it's like a big cosmic soap opera, of betrayal and all kinds of things. And the Greek gods will often just torment the humans or mate with them, producing the demigods. Hercules is a demigod with a god for a father and a human mother, so it makes him half god. Things like that. So the Greek mythology is one big soap opera. And, often the stories in mythology are the gods being very cruel to humans. And so there were some in the Roman Empire who just rejected all of that. And of all the religions, they were drawn to Judaism because Judaism had just one God. Monotheism, not pantheism. Pantheism, like a pantheon, pantheism means all the gods. Monotheism means just one God. Mono means what? Monotheism, one God. Atheism means no gods. So they were drawn to monotheism. They were drawn to Judaism because Judaism has one God, and it's a God who is righteous, a God who is, good, a God who speaks the truth, a God who gives moral orders and moral commandments. So there were Gentiles who were drawn to Judaism. But they weren't willing to go all the way and convert to Judaism. Because for a man, a Gentile man, to literally go through what it meant to convert to Judaism, it meant, one, circumcision, which, try explaining that to a confirmation class of 6th graders or things like that. I mean, circumcision, which for an adult man is a pretty big step. Circumcision, all the food laws, all the dress codes, all the everything. Many Gentiles were drawn to Judaism's moralism and monotheism, but they weren't ready to go through an elaborate process to literally become a Jew. They were on the fringes of Judaism. And sometimes they would actually literally stand outside the synagogue in the open window to listen to what was happening in the synagogue. They weren't allowed to go into the synagogue, but they would literally listen outside the window to hear the scriptures read. That's what Cornelius was. Cornelius was a God-fearer. That means a Gentile who was drawn to Judaism, but was not a convert to Judaism. Okay, so that's it. And we're going to meet, again, spoiler alert here, as Christianity reaches Gentiles, the first group of Gentiles to become Christians are the God-fearers. They are the ones who become Christians. They're the first Gentile Christians, are these God-fearers. He and his family were devout and God-fearing. They gave generously to those in need, and they prayed to God regularly, as in prayed to the God of the Jews, Yahweh. They prayed to the Lord. One day, at about 3 p.m, Cornelius, had a vision. He distinctly saw an angel of God who came to him and said, "Cornelius." Cornelius stared at him in fear. "What is it, Lord?" The angel answered, "Your prayers and gifts to the poor have come up as a memorial offering before God. Now, send men to Joppa to bring back a man named Simon, who's called Peter. He's staying with Simon the tanner, whose house is by the sea." Yeah, we got 2 Simons here, Simon Peter and Simon the tanner. When the angel who spoke to him had gone, Cornelius called 2 of his servants and a devout soldier who was one of his attendants. And he told them everything that had happened and sent them to Joppa. So Cornelius, this Roman centurion, this Gentile God-fearer, gets a message from an angel saying, "God's heard your prayers. You need to send some of your men to get this fellow, Simon Peter, and he'll give you the message you need to hear." So Cornelius does that. Meanwhile, back in Joppa, we go back to what Peter's doing. About noon the following day, meaning Cornelius' servants and men, as they were approaching the city, Peter went up on the roof to pray. Which for us would be odd for us to go up on our roof to pray. But remember, flat roofs, small crowded houses that were very hot in the summer. There's no ceiling fans. There's no, people use the roof the way we would use like a patio, So Peter's up on the roof of the house of Simon the tanner. He's praying up there. He became hungry. He wanted something to eat, and while the meal was being prepared, he fell into a trance. So Peter's up on the roof. He's hungry. and he falls into this sort of, semi-sleep trance state. He saw heaven opened up and something like a large sheet being let down to earth by its four corners. It contained all kinds of four-footed animals, as well as reptiles of the earth and birds of the air. And a voice told him, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." "Surely not, Lord," Peter said. "I've never eaten anything impure or unclean." The sheet is full of non-kosher animals. Remember, there was a list. Matter of fact, if you want to see it, go back to Numbers 19:11. No, actually, Leviticus 11. I'm sorry. Go back to Leviticus 11 for a minute. Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. So go back to Leviticus 11. Yeah. Read this whole chapter. But if you ever know what is kosher and what's not kosher, read Leviticus 11. Because it's a list of what food is kosher and what food is not kosher. Remember, kosher means clean, non-kosher means unclean. And that opening little paragraph, of the animals that live on the land, these are the ones you may eat. You may eat any animal that has a split hoof, completely divided, and that chews the cud. So, for land animals, the only meat that you can eat has to have a cloven hoof and chew its cud. What animals do that? Cows. What other animals do that? Sheep. Right. Cows and sheep do that. What animal that we eat a lot of doesn't do that? Pigs. Right. That's why Jewish people don't eat pork. Jewish people don't eat pork. Neither do Muslim people. Jews and Muslims, neither one eat any pork. And then it goes through what kind of fish you can eat in verse 9. Verse 9, 11:9. Of all the creatures living in the water of the sea and streams, you may eat any that have fins and scales. But all creatures in the seas or streams that do not have fins and scales, whether among all the swimming things or among the other creatures of the water, you are to detest. So, what does that mean? If you're Jewish, you can eat what? Fish, flounder, catfish, whatever. What can you not eat? Shrimp, lobster, crab, etc. So, and that chapter goes through, what bugs you can eat and which ones you can't eat. You can eat locusts. So, yeah. What birds can be eaten and, which ones can't. You can eat chicken, but, you can't eat bat, which is technically not a bird anyway, but bat is forbidden to eat, which we wouldn't be in this COVID mess if it weren't for somebody eating a bat. But, supposedly. Anyway, so it's a whole list of what you can and can't eat. So Peter has this vision, and a sheet comes down, and there on the sheet, there's pigs and, crabs and shrimp and, whatever else. All these unclean animals are on this sheet. And the voice says, "Hey, go ahead, have a bite." And Peter's like, "Oh, no, I know better than that. I can't eat pig. I can't eat shellfish. I know better than that, Lord." And the voice said a second time, "Do not call anything unclean that God has made clean." This happened 3 times, and immediately the sheet was taken back to heaven. So, again, this is like one of those moments for Peter. Like, all his life he's been told, this is the food you're allowed to eat, this is the food you're not allowed to eat. When and if you read those laws back in Leviticus, I mean, it's not just you can't eat pig or shrimp. There's lots. If you're an Orthodox Jew, especially, I mean, there's lots of things. For example, if you're an Orthodox Jew, you cannot eat a dairy product and a meat product in the same meal. So no cheeseburgers, no hamburger pizza, no meat lasagna, etc. And those of you like went to Israel with us, a few of you did. That when we ate it at the hotel in Israel, it was either a dairy meal or a meat meal, but never the twain shall meet. The meal either had dairy products or it had meat products, but not both at the same time. That's another kosher law. And in a truly kosher kitchen, two sets of plates, two sets of pans, two sets of pots. One for dairy, one for meat. Anyway, so there's all these food laws, all these kosher laws. I think in some Jewish, if you're Orthodox Jew, you separate the dairy and the meat. And you're not going to have a ham sandwich. So Peter's like, no, I know better than that. But the voice says, don't call anything impure or unclean that God has made. And it happens 3 times. It says, while Peter was wondering about the meaning of this vision, the men sent by Cornelius found out where Simon's house was and stopped at the gate. They called out, asking if Simon, who was known as Peter, was staying there. Why did they stop at the gate? Because it was locked? That'd be logical, but no. They knew they were not allowed to enter a Jewish house. Jews were not allowed to enter a Gentile house. Gentiles were not allowed to enter a Jewish house. So they respectfully stopped at the gate because they knew Gentiles could not go into a Jewish house and vice versa. So they call. Is Peter, the one called Simon Peter, there? While Peter was still thinking about the vision, the Spirit said to him, Simon, 3 men are looking for you. Get up and go downstairs. Don't hesitate to go with them. I've sent them. Peter went down and said to the men, I'm the one you're looking for. Why have you come? The men replied, we have come from Cornelius the centurion. He is a righteous and God-fearing man who is respected by all the Jewish people. A holy angel told him to have you come to his house so that he could hear what you have to say. Then Peter invited the men into the house to be his guests. Okay. So Peter's now been told a couple of mind-blowing things. One, he's been told, all those kosher laws, you don't need to worry about those anymore. That you've been raised with your whole life. Go ahead, have a ham sandwich. He's have some pork ribs. I mean, that's blowing his brain. And now, because of that, he's invited Gentiles, of course not really his house, I guess Simon the Tanner had to be okay with it. He's invited the Gentiles to come into Simon the Tanner's house. But Simon the Tanner was not Simon the Tanner would be excluded from most religious festivals because as a tanner, what's he continually doing? Catching dead animals, which made you unclean. So the job of tanner made you pretty much unclean all the time. So this passage, and I'm going to stop here because the next is a big chunk, but this passage does a couple of things. I mean, on the surface, one of the things it does is explains why we do eat ham sandwiches. Why do we have shrimp? Although not me, I don't like it. But I mean, why do you have shrimp? Why do we have those things? Why do we eat pork? Because here, we're told if God made it, don't call it unclean. God made the food. Which, is different from what the Old Testament says. I think I've mentioned a few times that when I was like 3rd or 4th grade, I just started reading through my Bible from starting with Genesis 1. And I remember getting, you get through, Genesis is easy to get through, or fairly easy, and Exodus, same way. You get to Leviticus, and man, it gets harder to, Leviticus is not easy reading. It's pretty dull in a lot of places. But I remember getting to that part, all these things you're not supposed to eat, and I remember thinking as a kid, oh no. Oh no. I'm not supposed to be eating all these things, and I didn't understand that for a long time. Or I guess I didn't worry about it too much, but I was like, oh, we're not following this. But this is why we can eat ham sandwiches. Because of...
With the list of who made that list in the beginning?
Well, it's presented in Leviticus as all part of the laws that Moses receives from God. A lot of people think that God gave the 10 Commandments and kind of the big laws, and some of the others are more, the priests started having to define those laws and get more into specific case law, and some of that may have come more from the priests trying to expand on God's laws. And so you could argue and debate how much exactly of that is directly from God. But here in the New Testament, here an angel says those laws are no longer in effect. Of course, Jesus says something, he says, it's not what goes into your mouth that makes a difference, it's what comes out of your mouth. In other words, it's not the food you eat that makes you unclean, it's the foul speech that makes you unclean. I think in the Old Testament, the food laws, the kosher laws, the dress laws, a lot of the laws were meant to remind the Jews, you're different. You're different from it. You're set aside for a special purpose. You're different. You don't act like the Gentile nations, the heathen nations. You don't act like them. You don't look like them. You don't eat like them. You don't dress like them. You're different. And keeping these food laws was a way of kind of continually reminding them that they were different. So this passage is one, it's a reason why we Christians eat all kinds of food. But really, the passage is about Peter hearing that what you Jews have called unclean, don't call unclean something God has made. Not just a pig, but a Gentile. This passage is more about Peter's willingness to go to Cornelius' house. Because remember, if there were two of the things Jews were not to do was eat forbidden foods and have anything to do with Gentiles. Peter gets this vision about the food. Don't call something unclean that God has made. Then immediately coming out of the vision, men come to the house where he's staying and say, a Roman centurion has had a vision from God and wants you to come and talk to him. And what is the message you just heard? Don't call anything unclean that God has made. That would include a Roman centurion. And Peter is willing to go to the house of a centurion, which is also forbidden by the Jewish law, at least by the traditions of the Jewish law. Enter the house of a Gentile. He has the Gentiles enter that house. He goes with them to enter a Gentile house. This is the crack. I mean, there's a lot of places in the book of Acts you might say this is a turning point. This is a big deal. But this story, the story of Cornelius, is the beginning of the Christian message going beyond Judea and Samaria and Galilee into the wider world, into the non-Jewish Gentile world. Because if this story doesn't happen and stories like it, Christianity remains a sect of Judaism. Without this broadening and this message from God that says, don't call something unclean that I made, all the other nations of the world, without if Christianity had remained only a Jewish sect, would there still be Christians today? If so, it'd be a very small Jewish thing instead of, a third of the planet claims Christianity. The movement of Christianity from Judaism to the wider world, and this story is how we see not just Paul that we think of as the apostle to the Gentiles. This is Peter. This is the rock. This is the leader of the 12. This is the one that Jesus basically puts in charge. This is Peter saying, I'm going to walk across this bridge and enter a Gentile house. I'm going to break all the Jewish laws that I've been brought up to know and at least supposed to follow. I'm going to break that and go into that Gentile environment. And we'll see next week how Cornelius start with arriving at Cornelius' house next week. So why don't we pray? Lord, once again, we are so thankful for the fact that we are part of a worldwide fellowship of the children of God, and grateful that Christianity spread and kept spreading and is spreading even today, and that we are all your children, and that anyone that you made in your image is precious in your sight. Lord, if you made us, we are yours. You don't make junk, Lord, and that every person is made in your image, and every person is precious. And we thank you that we all can call you Father. That if we will come to you, you will embrace us. And so we thank you for that, Lord. We thank you for men like Peter and Paul who broached a lot of danger and criticism to open the gospel to a wider world and help us to follow in their example.